Right, so this is the end of week review from the PAC inquiry, and honestly, I think if you missed the daily episodes, this is probably the one to listen to, because over these 3 days, a few themes really started to settle in and become impossible to ignore. I came away from this week with more questions than answers. One of the biggest issues hanging over this week was the continuing absence of key information. We kept hearing about the missing feasibility study, the missing economic model, the spreadsheet nobody outside the applicant seemed to have access to. At one point, it was described almost like a mystery box that updates whenever the facts change. And I think for ordinary people listening to this process, that matters. Because if the numbers are changing, if the assumptions are changing, if major financial arrangements are only emerging now under questioning, then how exactly was this application assessed before it ever reached this stage? That concern came up repeatedly this week. Savar Spurns said very plainly that they do not believe this application is fit for robust public scrutiny in its current form. Fermanagh and Omagh District Council's legal team raised concerns about whether enough information even exists for the Commission to make an informed judgment. And what struck me was that DFI never really seemed willing to meet that concern head on. There were moments this week where DFI appeared oddly detached from the detail of the application they are meant to be overseeing. Questions were raised around financial structures, royalties, liabilities, public cost exposure, even mine closure bonds, and too often the answers coming back from the department felt vague or incomplete. One exchange that really stayed with me was around the gold laundering concerns. Detailed references were made to warnings issued by the National Crime Agency, the OECD, the FATF, and others about vulnerabilities within the global gold concentrate trade. Questions were asked about whether any arrangements exist here to monitor or prevent those risks. The response from DFI was basically that this level of scrutiny is not usual. And sitting listening to that, I honestly thought, but this isn't usual. This is a massive proposed gold mine in an area of outstanding natural beauty, involving international finance, concentrate exports, explosives, long-term waste management, and potentially generations of environmental monitoring. I don't think people expect this to be treated like a routine planning application. The financial side of things became even murkier as the week went on. A huge amount of time was spent trying to untangle relationships between Dalradian, Wheaton, Minco, Orion, and various corporate entities connected to Canada, Delaware, and the Cayman Islands. And to be honest, even the commissioners at times appeared to struggle to get clear answers about who exactly controlled what and where money would actually end up. We heard again about Wheaton being repaid in gold at heavily discounted rates. Questions were raised about royalties, about whether taxes would be paid on concentrates rather than refined gold, about how much profit would actually remain here, and whether the public had ever been given a full picture of these arrangements. At one point, Commissioner McCreary directly asked why certain payments had never been mentioned before. And I think a lot of people following this inquiry, that sums up the feeling right now. Things keep emerging deep into the process that feel significant enough that they should have been openly examined much earlier. There was a lot of discussion this week also around the promised economic benefits. The jobs claims came under serious scrutiny. the headline wage figure turned out not to reflect what most workers would actually earn. We heard that many specialist jobs would likely come from outside the area, at least initially. We heard concerns that some of the employment projections were based on outdated figures from years ago, before major changes to the proposal itself. And one thing that kept coming up from economists and people with experience of mining elsewhere was how temporary and uncertain a lot of these jobs actually are. There was a moment where a representative for Dalradian described a 5 or 6 year role as long-term employment. Another acknowledged that jobs would tail away later in the mine life. People listening to this inquiry are trying to work out what exactly communities are being asked to carry in exchange for that. That question became sharper again when discussion turned to public costs. Policing costs had apparently not been considered by DFI to date. There were discussions around explosives, escorts, protests, licensing requirements, and the previous unpaid policing bill linked to exploration activity. And the scale here is enormous. The figure mentioned this week was a conservative estimate, according to Mr. Beattie. 44,000 tonnes of explosives over the life of the mine. To put that in perspective, Hiroshima, little boy bomb, was 15,000 tonnes, and Nagasaki, Fat Man, 21,000 tonnes of explosives. Nobody seemed able to clearly explain what the total public cost exposure could look like if this project proceeds. The PSNI and Department of Justice were not even present to answer questions around that side of things. Then after lunch on day 9, the conversation moved into mine's closure, and honestly, I think this was one of the heaviest parts of the week. People with lived experiences near other mines spoke about acid mine drainage and contamination continuing decades after closure. Questions were asked about what happens 15 years from now if pollution emerges after the company has long gone. The discussion around the closure bond was uncomfortable at times. There were moments where department representatives appeared uncertain about how these guarantees even operate. And meanwhile, campaigners and community representatives were pointing to abandoned mines across Ireland that still require public money and long-term management years after companies disappeared. One figure mentioned was around €100 million already spent dealing with legacy mining issues in the south of Ireland. That stayed with me because this week kept circling back to the same unresolved concern. Who carries the risk once the company leaves? Not during the profitable years, afterwards. And I think maybe the line that summed the week up best came from one of the local speakers who said, "We are lay people with a conscience." That landed because many of the people raising these issues are ordinary local residents who have spent years trying to understand incredibly technical material simply because they feel they have no choice. By the end of the week, I honestly got the sense that many people in that room felt they were doing the scrutiny they expected government departments to have already done. So that's where things stand heading into next week. Still no full clarity around economics, still major questions around public benefits, still major questions around long-term liability, and still uncertainty around who ultimately profits and who ultimately pays. And the inquiry rolls on. See you all next week.